Hello, this video lecture will cover tools that we use to present data. So we're going to look at different database structures, categorize different types of statistical software, and illustrate some of the more commonly used data visualization methods. Healthcare data is complex, and there are many different dimensions to it. We can look at healthcare data from the perspective of the provider, the patients, the payer or insurance company, or different services. To do that, we need an organizational structure for the data that can facilitate more efficient data analysis and reporting. These are typically kept in a database. So it's basically a collection of integrated records, a virtual file cabinet, if you will. And it should contain a description of its structure and be integrated. In other words, how these different data elements relate to each other. So if you have fields in a database, you have records, right? You have a field as a medical record number, date of birth, admission date, discharge date, and they can all relate to one record. In other words, one patient's set of information. There are different types of terms that you'll hear again and again in healthcare analytics, health information, and databases. This we're going to cover here. And one of the key ones is tables. Tables is basically a spreadsheet-like array of data, and it has rows and columns. Everybody seems to understand that. We have a relational database management system. These are things like SQL, Access, and others. And basically, it's software that's designed to maintain these data tables and relate one data table to another data table. Then we have SQL, Structured Query Language. And this is a programming language where you can ask the database a question. Finally, the last bullet point, entity relation diagram, shows how the tables in a relational database management system relate to each other. And with this, we have the database, we have the tables, and then we have the fields. Fields are basically different types of data, a medical record number, a date of birth, what have you. And a very important concept is the primary key. A primary key is basically a unique row identifier. So basically, it's a unique element that's only found on that particular row. It could be a patient ID number or what have you. It can be used to link a table together. A patient can have both a unique medical record number and a common admission date. So you could use that to link the two tables. Data dictionaries are basically a guide to how we manage data. Data dictionaries should map out what the data is and how it's managed. So in other words, a simple example is how we have dates of birth. Is it in 6 digits, month, day, year? Or is it in 8? 2 for the month, 2 for the day, 4 for the year, right? So it spells all these different types of things. It talks about the length of the data in the field, values that are allowed to be placed in a data field. So in other words, if you're saying it's a date field and you start to put currency, it's not going to work. And structured query language is basically the programming language. And some examples of this are MySQL, Microsoft Access, all these things use a type of structured query language to give us summary data. We could ask, think of these types of things as questions we ask the database. How many patients have COPD? What are the names of all the patients that have the COPD? So we have to select the data, and this is an actual SQL command, select, and then we can update, and then we can add rows of data or delete rows of data, either into a table or from a table. And we'll talk more about that when we get into the SQL project. So here's an example. Retrieve all the records for all patients from Milwaukee. So we see our select, which is the godfather of all SQL commands, patient name, last name, patient name, first name from the patient table, as you can see up here. Where the patient city equals Milwaukee, right? So then this is what our query looks like. Now we get into more things, more software that we can use. We have R. R is a command line driven software that opens data files. Typically, it's Excel, right? So it opens up these files, and you can use statistical analysis in some ways similar to SAS, statistical analysis system. It's similar to R, much more expensive than R, but does a lot of the same things. It manipulates large sets of data so you can draw some conclusions. SPSS is a menu-driven statistical software. And then finally, we have something we're all familiar with from HIM 200, Microsoft Excel. And these are spreadsheets. It basically is great for summarizing data. We use it a lot in business, use it a lot in finance, not so good about manipulating different types of large healthcare data sets. That's all I have for you. We'll see you online. We'll continue with our discussion of statistical packages used to analyze healthcare data in the next video lecture. Bye now.